Hello, my name is Stacey Sanders, and I am one of two program managers here at Advocates for Children CASA. I want to welcome you to Module 2 in our Role of a Volunteer training series. In the first module, Maggie spoke to you about all of the different volunteer opportunities we have here at Advocates for Children CASA. And today I'm going to specifically talk to you about the role of a dependency and neglect CASA volunteer in our office. And you might hear me say DNN. What I'm saying is not DNN. I'm saying dependency and neglect, D and N. Just want to make sure if I use that acronym, you know what I'm talking about. So as we move through the training, go ahead and write down some questions. If you think of something that you'd like more clarification on, I'd be more than happy to address that when we have our live webinar later in the training. So throughout the training, these are the things I hope you learn. You'll learn what dependency and neglect cases are, the role of and responsibilities as a dependency and neglect CASA, and then the importance of effective communication. And you will see a theme throughout our trainings. Communication is extremely important on these cases. Okay, so the cases come to us through the Department of Human Services. As you know, our office is made up of 4 counties, Arapahoe, Douglas, Alberta, and Lincoln counties. And each one of them has their own Department of Human Services. Every single one of them has a hotline, and calls come into their hotline or their child abuse hotline. And then the departments individually make a determination if an investigation is warranted, if nothing needs to happen, or if they need to refer out for services such as financial services or mental health services and things like that. Every single department has its version of what's called a red team. And a red team is made up of a variety of different folks at the Department of Human Services, caseworkers, supervisors, administrators, front desk individuals. Folks all come together several times throughout the day, and they go through all of the cases that come through the hotline and determine what kind of services, if any, or an investigation is needed. If they determine that nothing happens, it's closed out. If they determine that services are needed or investigation happens, next steps happen. Later on in the training series, you're going to hear from somebody from the Arapahoe County Department of Human Services, and she will be able to go over in greater detail how everything works at the department. One thing I want to tell you is that once you become a sworn-in CASA volunteer with our office, if you want to go through and observe Red Team and everything that goes into deciding what happens with cases, excuse me, talk to your case coordinator. We would be more than happy to set you up for that process. It's fascinating, so I encourage you to do that. So when the cases come to the department, some things determine if they're going to make them court involved. The majority of cases that come through the department stay on a voluntary basis. Less than 10% of the calls that come through the hotline actually become court involved. So the things that make it necessary to become a court involved case is if the child's basic needs aren't being met and there's neglect involved in that. So it could be child's needs not being met are medical, food, shelter, clothing, school. Their basic needs truly aren't being met. They have medical issues that aren't being attended to. There's not enough food in the home. The home is unsanitary and not safe for them to be in. And then we have abuse and neglect. So there's different types of abuse that folks think about. There's physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Those together make up a smaller percentage of all of our cases than neglect cases. The majority of cases that come to us are neglect. It's kids are left alone. There's not enough food in the home. There's not enough supervision. They're not getting to school. Those are considered neglect. And that's most of what we see. Not to say that you won't get a case that has a sexual abuse or physical abuse component. It's very possible, but neglect is the higher percentage of cases that we see. We often get questions about what happens if there's different parenting styles from folks that were not born in this country and have come to America from another country. As you know, the United States is made up of really diverse and amazing populations and people from all around the world. But when they come here, they are required to follow the laws of the country and the state. So if their cultural standards don't meet the community standards of safe parenting, they can become court involved with us. So I had a case a few years ago. Dad and the kids came from Somalia. Mom had fled Somalia because of the domestic violence she suffered when in that marriage, and she went to Sweden. The kids came over with dad, and in that country, physical abuse is a normal practice of parenting. Excuse me. And so it came to the department's attention that dad was physically abusing his son, and we later learned his daughter as well. The kids were removed from his care and placed with relatives, and we assigned a CASA volunteer. And she was amazing. It was really great work with them and supported them in school and supported the family that they were staying with. And long story short, the kids were removed from his care permanently because of his parenting style and because he physically hurt his children. The case came to a happy ending when the kids were returned to their mother's care, and they went back to Sweden, actually, and met their half-siblings for the first time a few years ago. And we keep getting updates. They're doing really well. So that's an example of when the cultural standards of how that family was raised and what they do in their own country differs from what's acceptable here in the United States. So once a case actually gets to court, every single one of them that comes to court has either an initial hearing, which means that the children have not been removed from their home and they're with one or both of their parents, or a temporary custody hearing when the child or children have been removed temporarily, we hope, from the parent's care. As a volunteer, you might be assigned to a case where the kids are still with one or both of their parents. The hope is that we don't have to remove children from their parents, or that we can return them to their parents' custody. In 2018, there's a federal legislation that was passed called the Families First Act. And briefly what that talks about is that family preservation really needs to be at the forefront of everything we're doing in child welfare. So we're working on looking at cases at the beginning to avoid them becoming cases. Can we get into the home and support families and give them services and resources to avoid us having to remove their children? Because removing a child from their parents' care is generally just as traumatizing, if not more so, than the abuse and neglect that they suffer when they are with their parents. So we do everything we can to try and keep the kids in the home. If we can't do that, that's when the temporary custody hearing comes in and they're placed outside their home. Our office, Advocates for Children, has a case coordinator at every single hearing. So from the moment a case comes into court, we know what's going on, we have all the documents, and we load that into our system called Optima that you're going to learn all about, and you're going to love it. It's the system that keeps track of your cases and your contacts and all things Optima. Yay, Optima! In the state of Colorado, is a children's code, and part of that children's code is a statute called Expedited Permanency Planning. And what that says is that any child who is 5 and under on the case, if they're removed from their home, they should be in their permanent home within 12 months. You may notice that it didn't say home to mom and dad, it says permanent home. We would really love to return children to their parents, but sometimes that's not possible. And so the idea behind this statute is that kids that little really need permanency as quickly as possible. So if they can be in their permanent home, whether it's with mom or dad or an adoptive home or with family, that should be within 12 months. That said, the judge can make exceptions to that rule or to that statute if parents are making progress to the point that if they just have a little bit more time, they can get their kids home. The judges are absolutely going to give that time most of the time. Or sometimes we're in a situation where a permanent home hasn't been identified yet, so we can't close the case until we have a permanent home for the kids. And on our next slide, it stands to reason that if there's an expedited permanency plan, there's also a non-expedited permanency planning part of the statute. And that says that any child who is 6 or older on the case, it applies to any case where the children are all 6 or older. It doesn't mean that we don't work as quickly as possible to get permanency for these kids. It just means there's a little bit more leeway on the time frames. And then the older kids, so teen cases, I hope that some of you are thinking about and wanting to work with our older youth, either through our legacy mentoring program or as a CASA volunteer on a dependency and neglect case, because the teen cases, the teenagers, they're fantastic. The littles are fantastic. There's pros and cons and ups and downs working with all ages. So I hope some of you are considering working with older kids. But some things to know if you do decide to take on a case with an older child is that in the state of Colorado, kids over the age of 12 have to consent to their own adoption. So that means they literally sign saying, yes, I agree to this adoption and this is the family I want to go with. Older kids are sometimes harder to place in permanent homes. If you think about teenagers, sometimes you think that they're the reason that a case is opened up and they're the troublemakers, and so they would be too hard to deal with and nobody wants them in their home. That is not the case. The majority of cases that open up with teenagers do have to do with the parenting style and safety issues in the home. Also, with older cases, we don't often terminate parental rights for teenagers. One of the big reasons for that is that it is hard to find them a permanent home, but also in most cases, the kids are going to continue to have a relationship with their biological family. And we understand that. It's natural for kids to want to be with their families. And so what you can do as a CASA volunteer or a legacy mentor, if they are going to maintain a relationship with their biological family, is to help support that. The last thing you want to do is say, yeah, you shouldn't have contact with your family. That's not a good idea. But instead, support that relationship, but also make sure they have resources to learn life skills so that they can become self-sufficient and take care of themselves while maintaining that relationship. So it's important for you to know that you may be on cases with older kids for a longer period of time. It can sometimes be well beyond that 18-month time frame that we ask you to commit to. And your case coordinator, when they call to pitch you the case and talk about it, will let you know if we think that case might be open longer than 18 months. I briefly want to go over federal legislation called the Indian Child Welfare Act. Some of you may have heard about this, but it's federal statute that was put into place in 1978 to protect the Native American heritage. Indian children have a right to maintain their heritage and their connection to their culture, and that's what this law is all about. In every single case that comes through the Dependency and Neglect Court, each professional on the team will ask about ICWA status from each parent. And the question is, to the parent, are you or your child eligible for enrollment in a Native American tribe? And if the parents say yes, the notification is sent to the appropriate tribes, and the tribe is the one who decides if the child is eligible for enrollment, only the tribe. And if they are eligible for enrollment, there's different things that can happen. All you need to know is if your case has ICWA involved, a Native American and a tribe is involved, your coordinator will walk you through what that means. One of the most important things you can do on any of our cases, but also particularly on Native American cases, is making sure they have a connection with their culture. And there's resources in Denver to make that happen. So again, if you have a case that involves the tribe, your coordinator will walk you through what that means for you. It doesn't change your work a heck of a lot, but we'll let you know what that means. Okay, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the CASA volunteer role, and we start with the best interest principle. I mean, after all, as CASA volunteers, we serve the best interest of the children that we work with. And what that means is we want them in a safe home, we want them in a permanent home, and as quickly as possible. So in order for you to advocate for the kids, you need to know them well enough to identify their needs. And that means you get to spend time with them. And that, friends, is the joy on the cases where you get to spend time with your kids and get to know them. And just through the course of doing different activities with them and talking with them, you'll figure out what kinds of needs they have. Do they need speech therapy? Do they need to be involved in extracurriculars to help their self-esteem and their social outlets and things like that? And what you get to do is make fact-based recommendations to the court about what you think those kids' needs are. You don't necessarily have to come up with the resources. Your coordinator and our office can help with that. But you can definitely say, based on my observations, it looks like Billy might do well with some speech therapy or an assessment for speech therapy. You also want to inform the court of the child's wishes, whether or not those wishes, in your opinion, are in the child's best interest. You will find this shocking, but sometimes kids and adults don't always agree what's in their best interests. I know. So if you don't agree with them, it's okay to tell them that, particularly if they're old enough to understand that, but let them know that their voice matters and you're going to help share their wishes with the judge And your coordinator will walk you through some of that. We'll talk more about that in our live training. Oops, so sorry, let me go back. I went a little too fast. Sorry about that. So the process of getting a CASA case, you're wondering, how did it even come to you? So like I said, we follow all the cases in court, and then we make a determination about which cases have priority to get CASAs. One of them is we do take a look at the expedited permanency planning cases, or EPP. Those are faster cases, and we want to make sure that those kids have all the resources and support and they're in a good, loving home. One thing about those EPP cases, we don't often staff cases with just babies on them. So if you're here to work with the just babies, maybe a little bit harder. The reason being, their needs are usually pretty easy to meet. It's not hard to place a baby in a permanent home if they can't go home to mom and dad. We do look at placing CASAs on baby cases if the parents need extra support, and you can work with the parents to help with reunification and offer support that way. Then we give priority to teen cases, and we give priority to referrals from professionals. So we get referrals all the time from the caseworker, the guardian ad litem, the attorney who serves the child's best interests, the court, other attorneys, parent attorneys sometimes refer cases to us for CASAs. And then we look at the needs of the children. So what kind of trauma have they been through? Have they been in various homes? So have they transitioned from home to home to home? Have they been in the systems before? What kinds of needs do they have? And then we put CASAs on those cases. And so once we've decided to assign a case to a coordinator and a CASA, the coordinator will call you to pitch the case, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Actually, we're going to talk about it right now. I'm sorry. So we call to pitch the case to you. And what that means is we will give you all the details of the case aside from the name and any identifying information about the kids. So you'll know the gender, you'll know the ages, and then you'll know what brought that case to court and to us, so you can make an informed decision about taking the case. You have the right to say yes to a case. You have the right to say no to a case. But what we would really like you to do is when we pitch it to you, we'd like you to sit on it for a day or two and think about it, and then come back and ask us questions. We're happy to have you say yes right away, but we really want you to think it through. We want it to be a good fit. That's really important. And when you do accept a case, and we'll do this in the live portion of our training, we ring a cowbell because it's a really big deal when you accept a case. So I will have a live cowbell for us in our live webinar. And we do have some cases that we look at and decide that we're not necessarily going to staff them. So some of the things that lead to that decision is they're just simply placed too far outside of our area and where our CASAs live. We try and not have you drive too great of a distance, but we'd like you to be open to the fact you might have to drive 30 to 40 minutes possibly to see your CASA kids, because the kids aren't necessarily in your neighborhood. So sometimes they're spread farther apart. But if they're too far away, we don't staff them. We also don't staff cases with volunteers if the child has high medical needs or developmental delays to the point that they need too much medical intervention. They'll have enough support from their care provider and their medical teams that they won't need a CASA volunteer, and that's beyond the scope of most of what we can do. And then from time to time, we have parents that are so volatile, we're concerned about the safety and well-being of our CASAs, and so it's as well as the kids, but it's not a good idea to put CASAs on those cases. That doesn't happen very often, but we do proceed with caution on those cases. Now, once you've accepted a CASA case, you're probably thinking, what have I done? What you've done is made the decision to really step up and make a difference in the life of a child who's been in the child welfare system. So what happens next is your case coordinator will complete an order of appointment. That's the legal documentation from the court that's signed by the judge that gets you all the information and access to the case. We get it loaded into Optima, yay, Optima, and distribute it to the professional team. Once you're assigned in Optima, you can review all the documents. So your coordinator will let you know, hey, you're good to go, get into Optima, take a look at everything. There'll be caseworker reports, court notes, the petition, which is the original document that opens up the case. So you'll get to take a look at all of that. Next step will also be that your coordinator will schedule a case planning meeting for you, the caseworker, the guardian ad litem, and your coordinator to get all the updated information that you can and find out how you can be helpful as a CASA volunteer. There will be no involvement with the children or the family until that meeting happens. And then next steps, the very next step is meeting the care provider and the children. And we'll talk more about that a little bit in this training and then in our live webinar as well. But that's where the fun starts because you get to meet your kids. Okay. So introducing yourself as a CASA can be a little bit nerve-wracking because, this is new to you. So one of the things you want to keep in mind is who are you introducing yourself to? Is it the foster parent, the kin provider, the parent, teacher, child? Foster parents generally know what a CASA volunteer is. Some foster parents are new and may have forgotten that part of their training, so feel free to explain your role to them. But the gist of whoever you're explaining the role to is that you're here to represent and serve the best interest of the kids. Your coordinator will walk you through good ways to introduce yourself to all the folks on your case, because it's easier to talk about that with individual cases. But basically, you want to make sure that you indicate you're a volunteer. We don't work for the Department of Human Services or the guardian ad litem. We are part of the professional team, and our recommendations are heard by the court. But folks really appreciate the fact that our CASAs are, in fact, volunteers and that they're giving their time back to the kids and to the families in our system. So make sure you stress that you're a volunteer because it's pretty awesome that you're doing this. So you are, in fact, part of the professional team, the caseworker, the guardian ad litem or GAL, and the CASA volunteer. We work together to get the best possible outcomes for the kids we serve. We're not decision makers on these cases, but we provide valuable information to the caseworker, the guardian ad litem, and judge to help make the best possible decisions for these kids so we get the best outcomes that we can for them. So you're an important part of the puzzle for sure. Okay, communication with the team. And again, when we're talking about the team, we're talking about the caseworker and the guardian ad litem directly. And if there's other folks you should be communicating with, you and your coordinator will talk about that. So it's really important for you to remember caseworkers and guardians ad litem have a lot of cases. You have one. So the only way the other team members are going to know the information you have is if you share it with them. So your coordinator will talk to you about that, but we have a template that you can use to have regular communication via email. Make sure that you include your case coordinator in emails with the team so that they are aware of case developments, and then we can help support you better. We're able to answer some questions for you, sometimes a little faster with the team. We do ask that you give them a little bit of time to get back to you. It may not be the same day that you email them. If there's an urgent matter, then you and your coordinator will work together, and your coordinator might get on the phone to the case worker, you might call the guardian ad litem, but together you'll figure out the fastest way to get to the team if there's an emergency. Otherwise, if it's not an emergency, please give them a day or two to get back to you and respect the fact that they have a lot of other cases. And then along the lines of communication with the team, we want to get along with them, just like in the picture, Hakuna Matata. So if you're not hearing back from the team or you're frustrated, reach out to your coordinator. We'd like to help you get better communication and we can support you in that. What makes it harder is if you send off an angry email or a frustrated email to the team, which has happened, then what we're doing is we're focused on the email that you sent instead of on making sure that the kids have all the services and support that they need. So let's keep the focus on the kids. We'll help you get the communication that you need and the response that you need. In case you hadn't figured out a theme yet, your coordinator is your person to help you work your way through your cases. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So there are several parties to the case, legal parties to the case. We have the respondent parents, and those are the parents who are responding to the allegations made by the Department of Human Services as to why a case is opened up. Respondent parents can also be family members who have custody of the kids, so grandparents or aunts or uncles who have had custody, can be adoptive parents, but it's whoever's responding to the allegations of the department. Then we have attorneys. We have lots of attorneys on this case. We start with the county attorney. The county attorney represents the Department of Human Services. and works directly with them and kind of is the attorney that handles a lot of the paperwork and keeps things on track. We have the guardian ad litem, as we've talked about, who serves the best interest of the children. And then each parent can have their own attorney. Most parents qualify for court-appointed counsel. If they don't, then they're more than welcome to get a private attorney. And from time to time, parents have their own guardian ad litem that serves their best interest. A parent might get a guardian ad litem if they have some delays and it's harder for them to understand the court proceedings, or if there's some mental health issues that are preventing them from really understanding what's happening. A guardian ad litem is appointed to them to make sure their best interests are being served and to make sure they understand the court proceedings to the best of their ability. Then we have the caseworker from the Department of Human Services. They're the social worker. They're the ones assigned to the case, hopefully from the beginning to the end. Sometimes we see caseworkers change because it's a difficult job and caseworkers leave, which means that you are one of the consistent people on the case and you know this case from beginning to end. And it's an invaluable resource to have a CASA on the case from beginning to end for the whole team. Then we have you, the CASA, and then we have two other folks that might be parties to the case. Special respondents are people who are not necessarily, that are important to the case, but not a parent. So it could be mom or dad's significant other that might have contact with the children if they're returned to the home. That same person could be the reason the case opened, domestic violence or other issues in the home. So special respondents, if the judge makes somebody a special respondent, they are subject to orders of the court and treatment plans. Interveners are folks who want to have permanent custody of the children. So they have a right to petition the judge and say, I want to be an intervener, which means they get all sorts of information about the case. They're parties to the case. They can speak at hearings. It can be foster parents who want to adopt the child and then become interveners and they get an attorney. It can be non-custodial grandparents who would like to have custody of their grandchildren. It can be custodial grandparents who have current temporary custody right now. So anybody who wants to have custody of the children and has a right to be an intervener will become part of the case. Your coordinator will work with you on all of these folks. We're responsible for getting out all the reports and everything they need to have. You don't have to worry about that. But if you have any of these folks on your case, special respondents, interveners, we'll walk you through what that means and what your role is with them. Okay. The key components of the CASA volunteer role. One of the big ones is information gathering. So what you're doing is you're looking at the case from where it currently is. We don't need to investigate why it was open because we already know that. But we're taking a look at where we're at right now and giving an objective examination of the needs of the family and the kids. And that comes from a variety of sources. One is just spending time with the kids and you getting to know them. Then it comes from care providers, parents, teachers, doctors, if it's appropriate. Anyone that's involved in the life of a child, if you can have a good rapport with them, you can gather information. And then facilitation. So you recommend resources and services for the child that works collaboratively with the rest of the team. And remember, you don't necessarily have to know the resource, but if you're identifying a need, it's in your job description to, advocate for that and make a recommendation. Advocacy, it's in your title, court-appointed special advocate. So you're speaking up for the child by making those fact-based recommendations included in a written report and also on the record in a verbal update, which will be talked about in another training. And then monitoring, you're keeping track of what orders specifically to the child were made by the court or what plans were made and are they being fulfilled. So an order was made that the child is to get into therapy and we're not sure where that's at. You can reach out to the team and say, hey, just checking in, where are we at with that? Again, you have one case, the caseworker, the guardian ad litem have a lot of cases. And so sometimes things get missed, not intentionally, and it's helpful for them for us to circle back and make sure everything's being done for the kids that can't be done. Okay. Excuse me. So, key components of the CASA volunteer role. I want to go into the information gathering piece of this just a little bit more. It's really important to remember that we are information gatherers and not givers. which means that we do not share information with parties to the case. We try not to get involved in the family dynamics. Sometimes when kids are removed from the homes, the maternal side and the paternal side don't always get along. I'm guessing right now you're thinking about some of the relatives. You are thinking, I don't know if I get along so well with you. It's the same thing, staying away from the family dynamics. We all have that one relative. We want to make sure that we're not giving information to foster parents or kid providers wanting information about the direction of the case. That can happen, particularly if they want to be a permanent option, or if one side of the family wants to know how dad is doing, or dad's side wants to know how mom is doing. Refer all of those questions back to the caseworker. You don't need to get in the middle of all of that. You just remind everybody that you're here to serve the best interest of the kids, and that's where you'd like your focus to be. If that becomes difficult, talk to your coordinator. You can give information to teachers as appropriate. Kim will go over this more with you when we get to the her educational advocacy piece. But sometimes it's helpful for teachers to know, particularly if they've gone from one school to another, what are the kids' needs in the classroom? How can the teacher support them? They don't need to know why they're in foster care, but knowing how to manage the classroom and help support that child is always very helpful. You might have an instinct that you want to take notes during meetings with different folks. If you can wait until you get to your car to take notes, that's probably better. Sometimes it makes folks uncomfortable when you're taking notes. For example, on my first personal CASA case, I had a co-CASA because we had 5 kids. And when we sat down with mom at Starbucks to learn about her kids, we said, hey, tell us about your kids. And she did. And she started talking about them. And so we weren't taking notes at that point. And I stopped her and I said, do you mind if I take notes just of what you're telling us? Because you clearly love your kids and we want to make sure that we're getting all the information. And she said that was fine. Otherwise, if you're going to take notes, just ask them and let them know why. You can't record the conversation. Please don't do that. But use your Optima contact logs, which you're going to learn all about. Those are a great way to keep track of the case. We review those as your coordinator. And then they really are handy when you're working on your written court report and your verbal update for court. So really use that Optima contact logs to keep track of all of your notes. It will make life easier for you when it comes to court reports, I promise. And speaking of those court reports, there's lots of court documents. So we have the petition. That is the document that we will read to you when we call to pitch you the case. And that outlines who all the parties are from the family side and why this case opened up. There will also be criminal history for mom and dad if that exists, and if there's any prior history with the Department of Human Services. But this will tell you why this case is here. Caseworker reports. The caseworker writes reports for most hearings, and so that's part of the court documents. Treatment plans for mom and dad. You will have access to those and know what the treatment plan expectations are for them. Court notes that are taken by the coordinator who's in the courtroom for every hearing. And then your CASA reports. Those are all legal documents and all part of the court record. Okay. So there are several possible outcomes, permanent outcomes in a dependency and neglect case. One of them, and the one that we hope is the one that comes to fruition, is return home. Like I said earlier, reunification is the goal in most of our cases. Reason there wouldn't be is if mom or dad are going to be incarcerated for too long, if one or both parents are deceased, things like that, or if they haven't participated in the case. But return home is primarily the goal. There's also a goal called permanent allocation of parental responsibility to a relative, or PAPR. And what that means is that parental rights are still intact, but a relative or a kin provider, somebody known to the family, is going to get custody of that child, which means they have all decision-making rights. The parents may be able to still have visitation, but that is usually up to the person who has custody of the child. Then we have adoption to a relative or non-relative. And what that means is that the parents' parental rights have been terminated so that the children are eligible for adoption. Then we have emancipation for the teenagers. And what that means is that the teenagers are going to emancipate from the system without ever having found a permanent home. An emancipation plan opens up all sorts of resources and opportunities for kids. And in the state of Colorado, kids can stay in foster care until they're 21. So if you're working with a teenager and they're going to emancipate out of the system, we really encourage them to stay in the system until they're 21. It opens up all sorts of resources for education and housing and mental health support and all sorts of things for them. So as their CASA, one of the things you can do is help encourage them to stay in the system. It's very tempting for them to not want to, but the resources are really, really helpful. And then the last one that is not very common, but it's called OPLA, or Other Permanent Plan Living Arrangement. And what that means is there is no permanent home identified. The child can't go home. So they're going to stay in long-term foster care until they leave the system. And it's likely there can be more than one permanency goal adopted at a permanency hearing. That can be return home and permanent allocation of parental responsibility. It can be return home, permanent allocation of parental responsibility, and adoption. Because while return home is the primary goal, there are concerns on some cases that may not be attainable. And so we want to make sure we have other plans in place for these kids to get to permanency. And then, of course, on your individual cases, your coordinator will talk to you about what the permanent plan is as decided by the court. Okay, so we are at the end of our training for this portion of it. So hopefully we did all of these things. You have a better understanding of dependency and neglect cases, what your roles are in a dependency and neglect case, and the importance of communication on these cases. I hope you've written down some questions. We will answer them when we do our live webinar, and I look forward to seeing you during our live webinar. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your training.